hoping to obtain further useful information. Such an archival source is a letter from the monastery of Tsoukas, now in the archive of the metropolis of Ioannina. The monastery is located at the area of the Katsanochoria villages, 20 kilometers southeast of the city of Ioannina. The rather badly damaged document was attached to a special paper foil measuring 21.1 by 15.6 centimeters during its conservation. The text comprises of 32 verses which occupy the whole width of the document and which, after the conservation, are almost fully legible. The letter was written by a certain priest and painter, Christodoulos, and was addressed to a certain painter, Ioannis. Lines 1 to 7 include a long greeting. Those of you that speak Greek can follow the text. This part of the letter indicates that the author had a great esteem for his friend and acknowledged his education. Furthermore, Christodoulos informs us that Ioannis had a son, while the phrase Agion Geronda, holy elder, shows that Ioannis was related to a person who had become a monk. As he continues, Christodoulos reports in lines 8 to 13 the reasons why he wrote the letter. He had already written a letter to a certain priest called George, a person also related to Ioannis. Georgios had detached some folios from Christodoulos' painter's manual, his Ermenia, as it is mentioned in the text, without his consent, and Christodoulos had asked them back, but to no avail. The former had detached the folios referring to the stucco, the kermes, which is the red pigment, the verdigris, or tsigiari, vardar as it's called in the letter, which is the green letter, the green color, a varnish, the flesh colors, the preparatory sketches, and the gold, all issues known from the painter's manuals of Dionysius of Furnas and others. According to Christodoulos, Georgios did this out of sheer envy, but no further information is given since Ioannis appears to have been already familiar with the incident. At this point, we are able to track down the identity of the recipient of the letter, since the only painter named Ioannis, who had a son related to a monk and the priest named Georgios, is none other than Ioannis from the village of Kapesolo, mentioned in his works from 1754 to 1806. This is Ioannis. Son of Anastasios, who later was known as Athanasius the monk, mentioned in inscriptions from 1728 until 1778. This is Anastasius. Ioannis' son is, again, Anastasius, like his grandfather, who was an anagnostis, or a cantor, and the priest Georgios was his brother, who is also mentioned in his works from 1759 to 1797. This is Georgios. He also had the son Anastasius. It's a whole family tree. Following that, Christodoulos asked Ioannis in lines 14 to 24 to copy the lost parts of his manual, being willing to pay any price asked. Apparently, Christodoulos had asked Ioannis' help before and had paid for that, but still owed him the sum of 10 Ottoman paras. This whole affair shows that during this period, even active painters, like Christodoulos, lacked the ability to work independently without guidance either from another painter or from a written manual. To gain Ioannis' favor, Christodoulos also used sentimental arguments in lines 25 to 27, writing, I'm translating from the text, because I do not have any manual from my old man, nor sketches, nor anything, and I can only brag and say that my father abandoned me, but the Lord embraced me. This phrase reveals that manuals and model sketches were bestowed from father to son, which is of course something expected, and that more precisely, Ioannis had got them from his father, but Christodoulos didn't. On the other hand, however, it appears that Christodoulos was not in such good terms with his father, who was also a painter, resulting in him searching for extra means to support himself through priesthood. The letter concludes with further compliments towards Ioannis, but also towards his brother, the priest Antikonomos Georgios, as he is mentioned this time. The reference to Georgios as an Ikonomos, which is some office of the church, offers a stable terminus for the compilation of the letter, since dedicatory inscriptions at Georgios' works document that he received this office between the years 1781 and 1786. Although the letter does not reveal who exactly was the priest and painter Christodoulos, we can identify him with the painter of 7 icons, 6 of which have inscriptions and are recently located and coming from 3 different villages close to Ioannina. The village Bradovari, which is currently named Harokopi, at the southern outskirts of the valley of Ioannina, and at the church of the Presentation of the Virgin, 5 icons from the iconostasis of the older church are preserved. 4 of them, apart from the one depicting John the Baptist, preserve inscriptions with the names of the dedicators and of the painter, who states Ioannina. This is the one stating Ioannina. Sorry, something did not appear correctly. It's some symbols that he's making. Or I'm sorry, I didn't check it before. Of the painter who states Ioannina as his place of origin. These are 3 of the icons. The inscription on the icon of Saint Nicholas is much more elaborate and also gives the information that all 5 icons were made by Christodoulos. At Neochoraki, or Neochoropoulo as it is known today, close to Ioannina, an icon of the Virgin dated in 1790 is preserved. The icon originally belonged to the old church of Saint Spiridon and carries an inscription with the names of the dedicators and the painter. At the nearby village of Stavraki, in one of the icons of the 12th Great Feast Cycle, dated in 1792, which are on the iconostasis, the patron saints of the church, the patron saint of the commissioner, and the military saints are portrayed. And we can find the name of the painter, the name of the commissioner of the church, the Petropos, as well. The inscription refers most probably to the completion of the iconostasis, because the big icons, despotic icons, are dated at least 35 years earlier. And the creation of the icons of the 12th Great Feast Cycle, most of which can be attributed to Christodoulos. All of the above icons are works of the painter priest Christodoulos from Ioannina and are his first signed works known to us. By comparing his signature in minuscule on the icons to the one in the letter, the identification becomes certain. We can see how he always joins the iota with the rho, and how the line of the st is going out of to the left, and of course this ligatura, this connection of letters, is all very similar. Not similar, it's identical actually. The letter, although not containing a date, can be dated on the basis of the person mentioned and of the works of Christodoulos in the first half of the 1780s, possibly around 1784. It is the period when Georgios of Kapessovo, the priest Georgios of Kapessovo, left the family workshop and created his own along with his 2 sons, something that happened after 1786. On the other hand, although Christodoulos undertook the decoration of whole iconostasis as early as 1784, it appears that he had not yet mastered the necessary competence, as his despair and fear described in his writings reveal, as well as the fact that by robbing his manual, Georgios deprived him of the ability to work. Although the letter does not mention the reasons and conditions behind the feud of the 2 painters, we can reasonably assume that there was originally some form of collaboration, or at least an attempt at collaboration between them. Finally, we should also mention that during the same period, towards the end of the 18th century, there was another painter and priest named Christodoulos, whose father was also a painter. He was the son of Nikolaos Plakidas from the village of Fortosi, close to Ioannina, appearing in his works between 1773 and 1787. Whether these 2 painters are the same person, notwithstanding they state a different place of origin, should be the subject of further research. Thank you very much for your attention.
We thank Diakon Grigorios Manopoulos for the very interesting and original material he presented to us. And now I will present you Mr. Cyprian Firea from Romania. He will present us the paper entitled Visual Intertext, the use of German prints in the 15th, 16th centuries Transylvanian painting.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me and accepting me in this very interesting meeting. It's my second participation. I really enjoy to be in Sofia with you. Thank you. And I will present a paper a bit from another perspective, a bit Western perspective, but at the same topic. So I wish I'm not out of the picture. So the medieval Western Europe certainly did not manifest the same adherence or observance to celebrated models and icons as its Eastern and Byzantine counterpart. Nevertheless, the West was not deprived of sacred prototypes, Pachiropoeta, visual relics, revered images, and so on, many of them having Eastern origins. Often, those prototypes have been copied and multiplied, and sometimes indulgences have been attached to them in order to augment their diffusion or reception. For example, this Imago Pietatis or Virdolorum from the Church Santa Croce in Jerusalem and Rome in the 14th century were related with an indulgence which later reached the inflationary level of 14,000 years of remission of purgatorial torments, and in the late 15th century it was multiplied using the print and gained a widespread diffusion. The printmaking, which was adopted and extensively developed in 15th century Western Europe, played a critical role in multiplying sacred images or celebrated models, and at the same time provided original artworks and images to be followed or copied. This was a technological revolution before the photography. Until the spreading of the prints, to make a copy usually involved the physical closeness and interaction between the original and the painter. For example, the model of the famous altarpiece from the Monastery of the Scots in Vienna, the so-called Schotten altar, was probably brought to Transylvania by an apprentice of the master in Vienna. Today, this master of the workshop from Vienna is identified as Johannes Ibbenbürger, so John from Transylvania. And probably he sent back home an apprentice who could reproduce his oeuvre. He probably had at hand drawings and sketches after the original compositions, and he partly transferred them on the altarpiece in Biertan, this locality in Transylvania. The developing of the printmaking and of the multiplying technique offered to painters a multitude of ready-made models, cheap, easy to transport, and easy to adapt and transpose into actual works, panel and mural paintings alike, but also stained glass or textiles. In the next few minutes, I would like to draw your attention on the impact that the prints had on the painted composition and images of Transylvania between about 1470s and 1530s. In the first part of my presentation, I propose a very brief summary of the masters copied and followed in Transylvania. In the second section, I intend to discuss more thoroughly a case study, which I consider meaningful for the topic proposed by this meeting. The discussion will try to reveal some features related to the painter workshop, its organization and functioning at the end of the medieval period, and also it intends to illustrate how the ready-made models were used in artistic enterprises. The following examples are not exclusively, but in large majority chosen out of my personal identification and discoveries. The great masters of the Central European and German printing had a significant influence over the Transylvanian craftsmanship, as documented by the provincial repertory of images. The prints had a large audience, and they circulated with great speed. The engravings or woodcut of the Gothic artists such as Master E.S. Martin Schongauer, the already mentioned Israel van Meckenem, as well as the great Renaissance masters such as Albrecht Dürer, Lucas Cranach, and their followers such Hans Schäufelein, Albrecht Aldorfer, Sebald Bechem, were widely appreciated. The first great master of the European engraving, the Anonymous, named after his monogram ES, was active between about 4050 and 4067. 67. In the 4070s and 80s, his work was already copied in Transylvania, as proved by the small altarpiece quoted here. Here you may see one of the 5 or 6 prints which serve as model for the local late Gothic master. The graphic work of Martin Schongauer had a more significant impact on the Transylvanian painting. You may observe in the slide the subtle use of Schongauer's print, Madonna and the Child with the Parrot, in the mural painting of the Black Church in Brașov. I would like also to add here just another example, which is significant. The engraving representing Saint Philip the Apostle is usually dated by specialists between 1418 and 1485. The fact that this print was already used as a model in Transylvania in 1483 certainly confined this interval to its first pass, closer to 1480. Israel van Meckenem, the mass publisher of the Imago Pietatis, was also documented in the Transylvanian repertory of images. It was acknowledged that the large altarpiece of the Passion in Mediaș was designed after Meckenem's Passion cycle and some other prints belonging to Schongauer. The Rest of Christ of Albrecht Adolfer, the master of the so-called Donauschule, the Danubian school of painting, may be recognized on another significant Passion altarpiece, the one from Parish Church in Sibiu, the capital of the Transylvanian Saxons. The other 7 or 8 compositions of the altarpiece are based on Dura's work. Sebald Beham, an apprentice and follower of Dura, designed prints and woodcuts of which some were replicated in Transylvania too. The altarpiece of Radesh from about 1525 documents the use of several prints of Beham. The woodcuts of Lucas Cranach were not very successful or widespread in Transylvania, but at the same time they were not absent. On several murals or altarpieces one may identify visual sources issued by this prodigious master. The altarpiece of Rikish attests the local reception of several prints from the Passion of the Apostles. Unquestionably, the master who exercised the greatest attraction and influence and whose graphic work was new and had the greatest success in Transylvania was Albrecht Dürer. Beginning with 1508, the earliest documented and dated sign of reception, dozens of his numerous prints have been copied, used, replicated, adapted, or transformed in order to serve to the creation of new images, murals, altar paintings, some 1,000 kilometers away from Nuremberg. Let us take a look at some examples showing the use of entire compositions, as here, or documenting the cutting out or the quotation of details, sometimes marginal, unimportant, or very small. On this Baptism of Christ, one can find visual quotation of the Mass of Saint Gregory as this small background character here, the angel with the sense. Cutting out from the glorification of the Virgin. Here, the tiny little detail in foreground with an angel chasing a rabbit was transformed in a puto, in fact, a puto with a lamp, in order to hint to the identity of John the Baptist. So it was transformed into an iconographic attribute. Not only characters but also landscape details were cited in Transylvanian painting, as we can see some small details on the altarpieces. Now I would like to draw your attention on a specific artwork, a small Renaissance altarpiece preserved now in Sighișoara. It was designed for a secondary altar, probably dedicated to Saint Anne, as the main iconography shows, the Holy Kingship. Recently, I identified its commissioner in the person of a learned clergyman, Lazarus, who studied in Krakow, Vienna, and probably Italy. In my previous research on this altarpiece, I was not aware to what extent the prints of Dürer have been used for this design, for the design of this and of its compositions. But the preparation of this paper offered me a good opportunity to take a closer look. I show you the results. From the beginning, I noticed that the general composition was based on a print of Dürer, the Virgin with the Child, surrounded by angels, dated 1518. From this model, the painter, a very good thief, as already classical terminology reminded us by Theocharis Sampouras reminded us, used the main character, the Virgin Mary, but he reversed the print and transformed the Virgin Mary into her mother, Saint Anne. From the same print, he used some details, such as the pot with flowers, or secondary characters, such as the small puto, whose stick was transformed into the iconographic attribute of Saint James the Less. At this stage, it seemed that a closer look to the prints of Dürer might be useful. His Madonna with by the wall, again reversed, was coated in the representation of Saint Mary Cleopas. The Holy Kingship served as model prototypes for Maria Salome, and Joachim and Alpheus were used as such in the altarpiece. The Holy Family offered the model for the representation for Saint Joseph. Thus, for the design of this central composition of the altarpiece, the Renaissance Transylvanian painter used at least 4 different prints of Dürer. Beneath the main panel, there is a small panel, the so-called predella of the altarpiece, on which a resurrection of Lazarus is painted. This certainly points to the commissioner of the altarpiece, the priest Lazarus. The chase for the models gave also interesting results. From this meeting at the Golden Gate of Jerusalem, the painter coated 2 small characters in the background, slightly adapted, and disclosed. From the Lamentation over Christ and the Entombments, 2 engravings from the engraved Passion of Dürer, there were 2 characters copied or referred to. From Christ taking leave from his mother, or maybe Schäufelein, the pupil of Dürer, was quoted the central character, Jesus resurrecting Lazarus. From Saint Peter healing the cripple, it was Saint Peter healing the cripple was used for this character too. So this predella, this small painting, used at least 5 different prints of Dürer for its composition. So this anonymous painter used the models in a convincing manner. He copied, but he also transformed, altered, in a kind of intertexting, or rather inter-imaging, in order to achieve his own compositions. This paper aimed to demonstrate how important was the impact of printmaking for the art of the painting and for the production of Western religious imagery at the end of medieval period, even in a remote province such as Transylvania. Thank you.
Thank Mr. Pirea for this very interesting presentation that fits perfectly to the general subject of our Congress. And now we are waiting for Mrs. Emily Spratt, that who is going to present us the paper entitled Ingenium Inventio Vis Facilitas, Western Influences in Post-Byzantine Art and the Question of Imitability.
First of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much to the organizers of this event and to Emmanuel in particular. It's really an honor to be here amongst you, and I've really gained so much already from the discussions and the papers so far. So thank you. Pleasure to be here. In the early modern period, much discourse was produced on the concept of the imitation or emulation of nature and antiquity, through which the model of classical rhetoric served as a means to examine the qualities of invention in the arts. Derivative of Pliny the Elder's writings on the progressive achievements of artists and Cicero's concern with the truthful representation of nature, in the Renaissance, the question of verisimilitude and imitability was one of pervasive interest. Not only did this discourse come to shape the nature of criticism in the arts, it has had a lasting influence on the treatment of art that falls outside the canon and has lent significantly to its emphasis on the representation of style. In this presentation, I would like to suggest that it was this model of critique that fostered the dismissal of Byzantine art on stylistic grounds at the very moment that the concept of art historical analysis was taking shape. Furthermore, it is this phenomenon that has most contributed to an enduring negative interpretation of Byzantine and post-Byzantine art in the West as a purely derivative tradition of imitations, particularly in regard to the art produced after the fall of Constantinople. As the papers from this conference have already demonstrated, post-Byzantine art developed both autonomously and regionally, and was in conversation with Northern and Southern Renaissance art and even Ottoman art, thus reflecting the rich cultural interactions of the period that should not be castigated as merely superficial artistic transmissions on the level of style. It was in the year 1417 that a major contribution to the discourse on imitation was made. This was the recovery of a Quintilian's De Oratore and the Institutio Oratorio in complete form. Indeed, the writings of the first century Roman rhetorician not only influenced the oratorical pedagogical tradition as it pertained to the model of Cicero during late antiquity, but also had a pervasive influence into the Renaissance. In one commentary on Ovid, Quintilian declared that the most valuable gifts of an orator were ingenium, inventio, vis, and facilitas, that is, genius, invention, power, and facility, which are the qualities that cannot be imitated, although he cautioned that they must be measured with sound judgment and even character. These texts provided an immediate point of reference for the growing discourse on imitability and lent to the development of a mass circulation of letters amongst humanists on this topic by 1450. Pardon. The letters between Pietro Bembo and Gianfrancesco Pico della Mirandola demonstrate the development of this discourse and reveal the manner in which classical art is used to buttress these debates. Narratives such as Zeuxis' decision to use the best features of different female models to make an ideal one, or the successful use of trompe-l'oeil paintings to fool beholders, are common tropes in these dialogues aimed at elucidating aspects of oratorical emulation. These debates were so widely engaged that by the second quarter of the 16th century, 1528, Erasmus published the Dialogue on the Ciceronians, which reflected the factionalism that existed around the allegiance to Cicero and the ideal rhetorical model to imitate. Essential to Erasmus's arguments, one again finds examples of the criticism of art, again based on questions of the imitability of nature as they had been already interpreted through ancient writers. It is from this intellectual framework that we are able to situate Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, published in 1550, which, like the oratorical discourse, emphasize the formal qualities involved in the act of representation and the artist who is guiding these developments. It is indeed from Vasari that we have that the most enduring negative attitude toward Byzantine art becomes established. In his famous description of the Florentine attitude towards the persistence of Byzantine features in paintings. In his discussion of the biography of the Florentine painter Cimabue, he remarks that the Byzantine style of painting, which he calls the maniera greca, was, quote, not in the excellent ancient Greek style, but in the crude, goffa, contemporary style, end quote. For Vasari, Cimabue broke with the, quote, dead tradition of the Greeks, for whereas their paintings and mosaics were covered with heavy lines and contours, his draperies, vestments, and other accessories were somewhat softer and more realistic and flowing. To be sure, the Greeks' crude, stiff, and mediocre style owed nothing to study, but came blindly following what had been handed on year after year by painters who never thought of trying to improve their drawing and never sought after lovely colors or credible inventions, end quote. Well, I do not need to describe the obvious fallacies of this argument to this audience. What is most notable about this formulation is Vasari's attempt to locate the origins of the Renaissance and its break from a medieval past and the Byzantine mode of painting current in the late 13th century. While this approach may be instrumental for building a narrative about the Renaissance as it blossomed in Florence, it fails to explain the continuation and development of the Byzantine style of painting after the time of Cimabue, despite the changes in Byzantine art throughout the empire and as it developed after its political collapse. Perhaps the greatest irony related to Vasari's influence on the interpretation of Byzantine art is the osmosis of his criticism to modern-day Byzantinists, who also are quick to dismiss post-Byzantine art on stylistic grounds and what some scholars describe as the polluting influence of slavishly imitated Renaissance motifs. While there has been attention directed to the sourcing of Western prints and engravings for iconographic models utilized in icons and wall paintings from the 16th to 18th centuries, the symbolic function of these representational choices and their visibly associated medium remains inadequately addressed. Without a doubt, this conference represents a major advancement in the field by addressing the subject of imitability, and it is not surprising that the majority of the papers have been on post-Byzantine topics. For these reasons, I would like to consider one example of the use of a Renaissance model for the development of a post-Byzantine iconographic type that is clearly unrelated to the issue of stylistic transfer alone. My aim in presenting this example is to insist that the notion of what constitutes an artistic transmission, or what has been most referred to as a copy in the last few days, is more nuanced than a stylistic interpretation alone would suggest, and that investigation of why these mixtures took place is essential. It was approximately at the same time that Vasari composed the biographies of artists that the innovative Cretan painter Michael Damaskinos is credited with creating the subject of the Allegory of the Holy Communion, probably in the 1560s. In the Damaskinos composition, Christ is the focal point of the composition, seated in glory. Christ presses his hand to his lance wound from which blood flows, and an angel who extends a golden chalice catches the blood at the lower register. Another angel in counter posture holds the Eucharistic offering, a small loaf of leavened bread stamped with a cross. The same angel touches Christ with his right hand, making the connection between the offered bread and the body of the Savior manifest. Christ holds an open book in his left hand, inscribed with the following text, "I am the living bread which came down from heaven. All that eat and drink this blood are immortal. Behold, from John 4:51, 54, 58, and 62. The Virgin and John the Baptist flank Christ who rests his pierced feet on a reflective orb. At the base of the composition are clouds which establish a celestial setting for the entire scene. In each of the upper corners, groups of 3 angels hold the instruments of the Passion. The inclusion of the leavened bread, however, together with the text inscribed on the book, suggests that the allegory of the Holy Communion is not a generic composition, but a visual assertion of Orthodox doctrine concerning the very nature of the Eucharistic offering. What is particularly interesting about the allegory is that the scene is found reproduced predominantly on the Ionian island of Corfu during the Venetian hegemony, although it also appears on other islands in the Venetian Stato da Mar. To date, I have collected around 20 different examples of this type, and the majority of the icons are from the late 17th or early 18th century. And I'll just show you a few of them here. Let me go. Okay, all right, and to go back. While many of the icons are now in private collections, a few are still in situ, found placed above the holy doors on the iconostasis, thus emphasizing the function of the icon for the particular space in which the Eucharistic liturgy is performed. Panayotis Vakotopoulos has suggested that the Damaskinos icon is modeled after Raphael's famous painting of the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament in the Vatican. As you can see, there is little stylistic affinity between the compositions, and the difference of medium cannot be ignored. It is possible that the contemporary engravings of La Disputa may have been the inspiration of Damaskinos' subject, rather than the artist's visit to the Stenza della Segnatura in the Vatican. What is much more evident than the concept of there being an exact iconographic model that the artist utilized is the demonstration of a response to the debate surrounding the use of azymes in the Eucharistic offering, which had been a sticking point of contention in the Council of Ferrara Florence in 1439. The proliferation of the allegory icons, particularly in the 17th and 18th century, suggests a desire to promote through visual means the Orthodox communion sacrament within the churches of Corfu in particular, which is directly relevant given the pro-Catholic sentiments of the Venetians controlling the island. Through this example, I hope to have shifted some attention to the concept of imitation as a part of a larger cultural interaction that, if examined on stylistic terms alone, would not have been seen as a mode of artistic transmission, that is, by manner of a visual reaction against the Western performance of the liturgy and the enduring Catholic Orthodox polemics. In conclusion, I would thus like to underscore that it was the very nature of the formative discourse on the subject of imitability during the Renaissance that has had a pervasive influence on the interpretation of post-Byzantine art on the level of style. While in many respects the icon type created by Damaskinos fulfill Quintilian's praised qualities of ingenium, inventio, vis, and facilitas in the creative act, the danger of interpreting post-Byzantine art through a Western model of criticism has perhaps been the field's greatest foe. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Professor Spratt, for her very well documented paper. And now we have some time for discussion. We'll start from the presentation from the paper of Diakon Grigorios Manopoulos about painter Christodoulos from Ioannina. Are there any questions? I have a small question. Are there quite a few evidences that Christodoulos from Fortosi is the same person with Christodoulos from Ioannina? Christodoulos from Ioannina was the great grandson of Anastasios Athanasios from Capesovo.
They are not related to the painters of this Christodoulos that they showed the letter from. No, the painter Christodoulos from Ioannina is not related to the family of the Capesovo painters. Not related house.
But I saw in the tree
Yes.
a Christodoulos,
son of. Yeah, this is just a coincidence.
It's just a coincidence.
Yeah.
Christodoulos. Okay.
It's just the same name. Now, for the Christodoulos of Fortosi, archival evidence does not exist. We are directed to this conclusion that maybe they are the same person by the coincidences, the same name, the same profession. They are both priests. The same. They have father that is a painter.
Yes.
And I didn't want to go to this discussion now. That the painter from Fortosi, as we can deduce from his works and his father's works, in the beginning they are working together, and later they stop working together. And in fact, when they are working together in one church, the father with the other son has his own, let's say, workshop, and the other son, Christodoulos, with a third brother, they have their own workshop.
They painted different parts of the church.
Different parts of the church, and in the inscription, their relation is not mentioned. This is the whole point. And furthermore, a second inscription, not published and unnoticed until now, shows that the father with the other brother, they came after the others left, and then they finished. It's a very complex inscription, very complex church.
Okay.
So it was like they are avoiding each other. They're avoiding to say that they are related. So I'm deducing that this father that abandoned him and that the Lord embraced him is this from Fortosi. But again, this is all circumstantial. I will have to check the.
Christodoulos from Fortosi was active in 1770s.
From 1770s until the 1780s, the end of the 1780s. They are
yes,
in the same period.
Just before the three churches that you showed us.
Yes.
Okay.
He starts from before that, but continues also during this same period.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Now, any question about the paper of Mr. Firea about Transylvania, the German prince? Yes.
Yes. Good. Okay, thank you. Mr. Ferrer, thank you very much for an interesting paper. Could you perhaps outline what the political situation is in Transylvania at the time and what the routes of communication were with the printmakers and how the prints might have reached them?
So at that time, Transylvania was part of the Hungarian kingdom until 1526. And until that moment, there were many relationships, many links with, let's say, university centers like Vienna, Krakow, and also with Nuremberg, because there were families of Nuremberg active in Transylvania as merchants, and they established in the big towns of Transylvania, such as the Hallers, Stromers, several, and they made a lot of exchanges. And I think the painter I showed was trained nearby, let's say, Schäufelein, a disciple of Dora, and I think when he came into Transylvania, he came with a big model, portfolio, yes.
I have a question for Mr. Firea. The copies of the German prints that you showed us were destined for Roman Catholic churches of Transylvania.
Yes. No, for painters from Transylvania.
For painters, yes. Okay. So, which was the role of Transylvania for diffusion of Western, German, or even Flemish prints to the Orthodox countries. I mean, there was a way. We do know that there was a way for the diffusion of Western prints, mainly German, but mainly Flemish prints, through Venetia.
Yes,
Venetia
this was one way.
To Crete,
Yes.
and then to Ionian Island, etc. But has been there a way through Transylvania for the same the diffusion of the same prints?
Yes, it was a way because early in the 16th century, in Transylvania were established some, let's say, printing houses, not big, but some printmakers were active in Brasov, for example, and also in Sibiu. The earliest known is in Sibiu in 1510 or something like that. And there are some, but very few samples of the works of these printmakers in Sibiu. And also the Orthodox population and Orthodox churches received this influence of Western prints through some exchanges. It is obvious from the later 16th century. So, thank you.
Another question: are there any imitations of prints, copies, not imitation, copies of prints of the Sadler family in Pennsylvania?
For the 16th century, no. But in later, I think in 18th century, we can see some copies after Sadler.
Okay, thank you.
May I ask something? Yes. Do you think that because the time of it is very, very close, just a few years,
yes,
that the original masters knew that they were copied? So, what went on in their minds when they found out that, some kilometers away, there was other painters that copied their work? Was that some kind of primitive copyright?
No, the first issues, the first problems came when Dürer saw Marcantonio Raimondi copying his prints. Then because Dürer himself sell the prints and maybe her wife too in the market, and this was not a problem to copy these, but there was a problem when Marcantonio Raimondi copied his prints, and he put, as Israel van Meckenem, he was the first pirate, and he made a lot of Schongauer's print as his own. Happened so fast.
Now, any questions about Professor Pratt's paper? Yes, Mr. Chambers.
Just a comment. I'm very drawn to having this perspective when it comes to 15th and 16th century art, whereas as Ms. Anopoulos' paper showed, in the 18th and 19th century, when one does not have the erminia, he just cannot function. So this yeah, yeah, he's an orphan without the erminia. So that it goes well with creating painters and painters who know how to paint and to make a new composition. But in 18th century, this is maybe this theory cannot be exactly applied. I don't know. Maybe
yeah. I definitely agree with you that the situation is changing definitely in the late 18th and 19th century, and I don't go into the 19th century myself. However, what I was trying to say actually was that it's interesting that the time that these debates are going on is also the birth of art history as a critical discipline in and of itself. And at the moment of the inception of our discipline, there's this negative attitude about Byzantine things and Byzantine styles already even being seen as a monolithic kind of concept. And so when we kind of nuance that with what was actually going on in the period, then we realize that, okay, yes, these things are actually maybe even working with Renaissance notions of imitatio and emulatio, but it doesn't. But it's still a problem to interpret in that manner because it's part of a completely different tradition. And so I'm responding to this because, in fact, the historiography on the post-Byzantine material, even the 18th and 19th stuff, is still infected by the Western tradition of interpretation, which is a largely stylistic one, which ultimately is derivative of these debates around imitability that happened, that then Vasari also picks up in the famous Lives of the Artists. So I think, so that was why I was saying that it's this theoretical model that is absolutely a problem. So I'm in agreement with what you're saying. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Do you want to pass?
Your name is
Nenad.
Nenad.
Thank you very much. I have just a comment. I don't have some special question. I agree with you and your thesis. And of course, that is the biggest problem in our discipline or in art history in general, that we now have this kind of comparison or making analysis of the what you call post-Byzantine. I will explain. I don't call that post-Byzantine. I have a problem with this term. But with this Orthodox art in the modern time. So first of all, we know to the development of the art history, there was absolutely total negative reception of everything what was Byzantine. It started to change about the half of the 20th century with the modern. You know, Picasso told, we have excellent paintings on the Balkans, as I am doing. But what happened then? Then our Byzantinists in Serbia, in Greece, they started to reproducing this Western discourse about the post-Byzantine, Ottoman. They say, no, that is the fake. With the absolute same arguments. It is dead, it is not well painted, and so on. And then they made the biggest problem, actually, that was with the naming. You know, what is the name, how you give the name, actually explains a lot. So people are using, I'm not using, I'm against the term post-Byzantine art. Of course, there's so many Byzantine elements, or Byzantine manner, or a la Byzantina, or what you want. But post-Byzantine art means it is actually very nationalistic term and so on. But you look in this conference, it is a huge topic of the Orthodox art, which is really very different if you're going to the Ionic Islands, Epirus, Serbia, Bulgaria, or Russia. It's actually not the same. So many models. So, of course, now we are in front of the new field, and if we forget to compare it with the past, it is best, it's not. It's like in the 14th century, it is this or that, or to compare it with the West. Maybe we could just try to see what that is and why it is so. It is absolutely clear. You will see this Transylvania, fantastic examples, and then you have Ionian examples. No, two different ages of the world, and of course, it's a very different stylistic and everything else is different. And we have different context. If we think in the terms of context, we will for sure reach some new horizon for understanding this whole visual practice.
Thank you very much for your observations, and I will shamelessly say that when I was using the term post-Byzantine, I was footnoting a publication I did on the term post-Byzantine, so I personally do think it's useful and have set some parameters about how I'm using it. the limitations of time didn't get into it. But I think that in many ways this is the elephant in the room, is that we do have to have a discussion, somewhat trendy in art history to use, but also is a problematic term because it's related to the colonial discourse. All those things need to be considered, and I thank you for pointing that out. And you're absolutely right in terms of the 20th century reception of these things. It's fascinating that once again you have these very basic early commentaries of the castigation of Byzantine art in this negative manner done in the same way. And so I actually see this as the great paradox of what I will call post-Byzantine art, is that somehow the historiography, even by Byzantinists in this field, is plagued by this original negative notion of how the art should be examined in just a very static manner, Byzantine, uniform, and crude, and purely stylistically. So thank you for your comments.
Any other question? Yes, Mrs. Bassi.
Vasari wrote 2 centuries and more, I think, after Cimabue. Yeah. How do we know that what he wrote about Cimabue was true? I mean, about the models.
That they are so, and he was saying that Cimabue's style was more soft. Was one of his words, more free flowing. That it actually was reflecting a loosening of the models. Are those the comments that you're referring to specifically?
No. You show us a part of Vasari's Life of the Artist about Cimabue, where he writes that Cimabue didn't use models as his contemporaries. It was underlined, I think, on the slide you showed to us.
The quote is, Cimabue broke with the dead tradition of the Greeks, for whereas their paintings and mosaics were covered with heavy lines and contours, his draperies, vestments, and other accessories were somewhat softer and more realistic and flowing. To be sure, the Greeks' crude, stiff, and mediocre style owed nothing to study, but came blindly following what had been handed on year after year. So that's referring, the Einstein, because it's referring to the models. Yeah. He's referring to the Greeks. Yeah.
How do we know that Vasari was true?
I'm not reading that as a statement of historical truth. I'm reading that as he's making the point that the Greeks are derivative in their interpretation of things, and that that everything essentially looks the same. It's just it's an unnuanced copy. I'm not reading that as an actual historical accuracy, but this is again using the same sort of rhetorical vocabulary and these tropes about how imitation is taking place in this much larger discourse on the imitatio and the emulatio.
Thank you.
But I just want to, you're right to highlight, it's fascinating. Vasari is talking already about Cimabue, which is old, and is not looking at all at what is being produced, the contemporary Byzantine art or post-Byzantine art of this period at all. So already there's a lag, and already there's at least from a Western perspective, there's already a kind of crystallization of what that is, and a negligence of the developments of its continuations, which were clearly going on. So thank you for bringing up this very important issue.
Are there any more questions? I would close the session with just a short remark. There is another, I would stress another aspect of the question of the imitability of in post-Byzantine art. It means the influence of the prints not only on the iconography, but also in some cases on the style of the painters. Emanuel Janes renders the faces with very thin lines in a clear manner. If you, for example, see the icon of Labovitsa in the Byzantine Christian Museum, it's clearly influenced. He imitates the engravings. The fact that in order in an engraving to render the plasticity, you have to use lines, of course, engravings, not color. So he imitates at least Emanuel Janes and perhaps some of his disciples.
Yeah, just to add to your point, which is a wonderful one, is that also the nature of how the actual engraving plates were designed is often if you have a sort of landscape in the background, then you have just a blank space. And so there's the problem that the plate doesn't actually fall down
Yes.
and then become covered in an ink. So actually, you often see then these little birds flying in the sky in sort of the upper right-hand corner, for instance, and actually in your presentation, we saw some of those little birds, just almost as like a little like black bees, and actually those were used to hold the plate up in the representation of the sky,
yeah.
and then you see that technologically necessary inclusion then coming into some of the post-Byzantine paintings,
Yes.
which is purely based upon the need of how the plate stands up. So
Yes.
that's an excellent point also.
Okay, so we're closing now the session and we have some time for coffee. Thank you very much.